IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. This is a Friday episode, which means that we are going to talk about something that isn't strictly policy related, and instead meditate, as I tend to do, upon the grandeur and complexity of human history. I have with me today Aditya Ramanathan and a new colleague of ours, Aditya Pareek. Hi guys.
Hello.
Hi.
So what we're going to be talking about today is a fairly remarkable Indian life. Now there's a general tendency when we think about Indians from the colonial period, we only seem to know about the great Netas and Netajis and Gandhis and Nehrus and Jinnahs, but not necessarily about how the common man really perceived the freedom struggle and how in the highly interconnected and chaotic world of the colonial period of the 19th, 20th centuries, some insignificant little decision that happened to be taken on one part of the world might profoundly affect the way that millions of other people go about their lives. Today, we're going to be talking about the life of a chap called Mir Mast. He was born in the modern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province near the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, which made him a subject of the British Raj. Now, sometime in the mid-1910s, Mir Mast found himself in the trenches of the Second World War, facing absolutely horrific conditions in the trench warfare of the time, as you can imagine. And he took a decision that would end up entangling his life among the great tide of the colonial independence struggle. So let's first try to understand who Mr. Mast was, why he took the decision that he did, and the absolutely insane journey that his life then took after he took that decision. So over to you, Aditya. Take us to the trenches of the Western Front. What was Mir Mast's life like? And why did he take this decision that I've been alluding?
Sure. In 1914, once the war broke out, Indian troops were almost immediately sent to reinforce the British Expeditionary Force in Western Europe. At this time, just for context, the Germans were basically making a big swing into France via Belgium, and the British were basically trying to stop them. And so the Indians landed in September of 1914, and they were quickly deployed along this line. And this line also, very quickly became static because both sides had basically tried to outflank each other. And all they had on one side was the sea and the other side the Swiss border. And so you had a static series of networks of trenches. And in these, you would have very effective defensive weapons. You would have massed artillery, machine gun fire. And so these lines would not move drastically for a long time. And this was basically the horror into which Indian soldiers were thrown into. This was a large-scale industrial war of the sort that the British Indian Army at that time was not attuned towards. It was basically an imperial police force. It fought on the frontiers. It fought against small states, against non-state actors. Being thrown into something like this was a complete cultural shock. It was an organizational shock because, for example, if you lost your British officers, the replacements would be other Britons who did not necessarily speak your language, for example. So it was a fairly brittle force in that sense and was not built to take mass casualties and sustain a long fight over months or years. And so you do have these soldiers describing in fairly plaintive letters back home the sort of horrors that they're seeing. Now, if you were a soldier on the Western Front, you really did not have much of a choice. Where do you go? This is France. You can't run away from the lines. They're well guarded. And even if you did, where in France would you go? You don't speak the language. You don't do anything. You can't do anything. Now, what about if you defect to the Germans? Well, you don't know what that entails. And secondly, what are the consequences going to be for your family back home? You have people to support. There's the respect that you have within the community that would be lost if you defected. Now, the difference for someone like Mir Mast was that his incentives were different. Mir Mast was a Kambar Khel Afridi. Now, these Afridis came from the Tira region, which was an area that was not directly ruled by the British. And so, in that sense, they were outside the direct administration of imperial authorities. And so the consequences of a defection were less. Now, it's not just the consequences that matter here. There's also what's drawing someone like Mir Mast to defect. And that is that the Germans had very consciously portrayed themselves as the champions of Muslims. This had been actually going on for nearly 2 decades. The Germans did not have colonies with large Muslim populations of their own. On the other hand, their adversaries or potential adversaries, Britain, France, and Russia did. And this was a pressure point that the Germans had cultivated for a long time.
This is by far one of the most interesting dynamics of the whole World War period that I've come across, Aditya. I mean, very often when Indians think of Muslim involvement in the freedom struggle, we have heard vaguely of the Khilafat movement. But I'm sure like a lot of our listeners aren't aware that the Khilafat movement, in the way that it eventually manifested itself, had a great deal to do with the German Empire's attempt to weaken the British Empire, and in particular, the role of Kaiser Wilhelm II.
Absolutely. The Germans were great at spreading this fake news that Kaiser Wilhelm II, the ruler of Germany, had in fact secretly converted to Islam and had performed the Hajj and was actually referred to in secret as Haji Wilhelm. Now, we might laugh at this, but this seemed to be reasonably effective propaganda. But when you combine that with the fact that the Germans were allied with the Ottoman Turks, and the Ottoman Turk ruler was the Caliph of Islam, the Germans did have some veneer of legitimacy, even if people could see through their motives. In any case, it would appear that Mir Mast and several of his compatriots despised the British enough and thought the Germans provided some opportunity not just to get back home, but also to, as he himself said repeatedly, to wage jihad. And so on the night of March 2nd, 1915, Mir Mast, along with several of his compatriots, crossed no man's land and went and surrendered to the Germans. They were actually treated very well. During their interrogation or questioning, Mir Mast very clearly told the Germans that all that you needed to do in your propaganda leaflets was to say, "We promise you a good Mauser rifle and a pistol." This was a man who really believed that he could get a lot more Afridis to defect, and that this was actually an opportunity to go home. Now, this opportunity to go home would actually come because naturally the Germans were actually putting into effect plans to instigate the Muslim world. But before we get to that, let's just talk about Mir Mast's brother, because that gets quite interesting. Mir Mast's brother was a man named Mir Dast. He was the elder brother, and it seems that he was quite upset by his brother's actions, and the shame it seemed to have brought on him and his family. And so the very next month, about 5 weeks later, he performs an extraordinarily heroic deed. This occurs in late April 1915 during a German gas attack. The Germans attacked the British trenches with chlorine gas, and Mir Dast resisted the Germans. He evacuated several soldiers to safety, and for these extraordinary deeds, he was actually awarded the British Empire's highest military honor, the Victoria Cross.
It is just so fascinating to me to see the resurgence of the subcontinent's ancient, like aristocratic warrior culture. So many new forms in the colonial period, right? The listeners who checked out last week's Friday episode will know that, like, I'm like a more of a medieval Deccan guy. Now, in the medieval Deccan, it's quite normal for rulers to recognize military combat. And just generally bravery in battle is a great way for men to kind of establish themselves and their family lines as being trustworthy and worthy of recognition in the eyes of the king. So it's quite interesting to see in a totally different context a descendant of a totally different kind of warrior culture performing in order to kind of rescue his family honor because of the dishonor that his brother has brought upon the family, and be recognized in the eyes of no less than the quote-unquote king emperor of Britain and all her imperial dominions.
Absolutely. It does mean something to him when the king himself comes and pins that Victoria Cross on him. He actually says so in a letter that was later translated and which you can see even today. Now, you have to imagine Mir Dast has gone and done this extraordinary deed, but his brother is meanwhile just neck deep in intrigue. And what is going on is that the Germans are basically putting together an expedition to go to Afghanistan. The party that he's going to be joining is led by a fairly extraordinary man named Werner Otto von Hentig. He was a diplomat before the war. He had then become a cavalryman serving in the East in Poland. And Hentig is, fluent in Persian. He's superbly fit. He's just an extremely competent man. And he's joined by Mir Mast and 5 other Afridis, some Germans. There's also another Indian Muslim soldier from Punjab who's joining this group. This really extraordinary multi-ethnic assortment of people make their way from Germany through the Balkans into Ottoman Turkey. They're joined by another 2 very extraordinary people. These are members of the Ghadar Party. The Ghadar Party were Indian revolutionaries, mostly based abroad, Vancouver, San Francisco, Switzerland. As soon as the war broke out, the Germans saw this Ghadar Party as an opportunity and helped them set up an office in Berlin. And so the 2 people from the Ghadar Party were a man named Raja Mahindra Pratap. Mahindra Pratap came from a little princely state near Aligarh. The other man was Maulana Barkatullah. Barkatullah had been a preacher and an intellectual. He'd been a professor in Tokyo. He had moved to San Francisco for a while. He was one of those people who had lived in exile for a long time and was very much involved in the Ghadar movement. And so this extraordinary group of people now find themselves in Istanbul, the capital of Turkey. Pratap and Hentig have an audience with the Caliph, who gives them very useful advice. He actually says, please avoid the British. To which I'm sure they said, thank you very much. And anyway, now this group now heads through Mesopotamia, what is today Iraq, into Persia. Now in Persia, they're joined by another party of Germans led by another fairly extraordinary man named Oskar Ritter von Niedermeyer. And this large party now headed towards the Afghan border. They made their way through a salt desert, the Dasht-e-Kavir, which is one of the most inhospitable, most remote areas in the world. You could only travel at night. You would frequently travel by following the trails of the carcasses of dead animals along the way, because it's very hard to navigate also. They eventually made it across the Afghan border in late August of 1915, and they reached Herat, which is not far from the border with Persia, where they made contact with the local governor. From there, the Afghan authorities conveyed them in fair amount of luxury to Kabul, which they reached on October 2nd. 3 weeks later, the German emissaries and Pratap and Barkatullah were given an audience with the Afghan emir. Now, what is their purpose in going to Afghanistan? To put it very simply, what they would have liked best of all is to simply flip Afghanistan, to get Afghanistan to join Germany and Turkey in war against British India. Now, even if that wasn't possible, even if the Afghans were to make even some adjustments to their policies, that would basically force the British to keep more troops in India, which means less troops in other fronts, especially in the Western Front in Europe. So this was really about diverting British resources, dissipating its efforts.
Just 1 second, Aditya. So this expedition has arrived in Afghanistan now, but the Germans are hardly the only European power interested in Afghanistan, right? Even leaving aside the British, the real terror that the British had for another European power getting involved in the broader geopolitical game of South Asia was the Russians. And I think Aditya Pareek had a question about what exactly the Russians are up to in Afghanistan at this time.
So do we have any evidence that the Cheka at the time, which was a great part of Russian advances in Central Asia at the time, or I'm not exactly sure which year exactly we're talking about, around the Battle of Passchendaele or a little further in time. But the Cheka or the Russian Imperial Service, did they have any involvement at this point?
They did not have any involvement in Afghanistan directly. Now, in northern, I'm just trying to simplify things, but in northern Persia, where the East Persia cordon was being set up, the Russians were involved from the north, because the Russians tended to dominate northern Persia and the British more southern regions. But there's no other further involvement. In fact, Afghanistan was actually at this time full of escaped Austrian troops. So these Austrian troops had been captured in 1915 and had been sent east to Siberia, from where they had escaped and made their way to Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was a safe zone for Germans and Austrians.
So the impression I'm getting is that Afghanistan was really quite a pleasant place to be if you were from one of the central powers, right? Did Afghans really chafe at the amount of influence that the British extended over the area because of their broader paranoia about other colonial powers getting into the game there?
Yes, there was actually a fair amount of resentment in Afghanistan at this time. In Kabul, there was a paper being published called Sirajul Akhbar, which was edited by a man named Muhammad Tarzi. And Tarzi was a fairly progressive, modernizing figure who wanted Afghanistan not only to assert its own independence, but also to modernize. The modernizers were not the only force that chafed against the British. There were also the religious conservatives. And the Afghan Emir, Habibullah's own brother, Nasrallah, actually headed this faction. These were people who saw the British as enemies of Muslims and wanted Afghanistan to take a more conservative turn and also be independent from British control. So there were forces already in play in Afghanistan that really resented this British stranglehold over their country. Remember, Afghanistan at this time was not allowed to have diplomatic relations with any other country. It only had a connection to British India, and that was through a single British agent in Kabul who was effectively a spy.
And what was this British agent up to? I remember in the discussion that we had before this recording, you alluded to the fact that the British really had a network of quote-unquote embassies across the broader Middle East, including Persia. And that the purpose of these embassies was basically to keep a very, very close eye on domestic goings on and make sure there was no risk of any other European power basically getting a foothold in this area and threatening their grip over India. And I can imagine that this British gentleman who was based in Kabul at that time would not have taken very kindly to the Niedermayer expedition.
So actually the British had multiple consulates in Persia, which were effectively spy stations. They did not really perform much other in ways of diplomatic functions. In Afghanistan, they were restricted to just one person, a British agent, as they used to be called, and this person would actually be an Indian Muslim by tradition. So it's quite interesting. You have one Indian Muslim there as a loyal agent of the British. You have two brothers who are split, one joining the Germans, the other trying to prove his loyalty. So I suppose it does give us a sense of how diverse loyalties were, the politics of Indian Muslims were, even in the British Raj, and why, for example, German or Turkish pan-Islamism would not always find it easy going among such diverse populations.
That is absolutely fascinating, Aditya. So let's just come back to the expedition, though. What exactly happened next? Did they manage to succeed in their great idea of getting Afghanistan to rise up against the British?
Yeah, quite evidently they didn't. What quite evidently happened is that the Afghan Amir Habibullah was basically stringing the Germans along. He was using them as leverage to extract concessions from the British. That eventually came when the British increased their annual subsidy to Afghanistan by 2 lakh rupees, which is a fairly tidy sum back in the day. And then in December of that year, Habibullah started negotiating with the Germans for some sort of treaty. Now, this treaty would not really have force because it's not signed by the German head of state, right? But this treaty basically agreed that if the Germans were to provide a certain amount of military aid to Afghanistan, then Afghanistan would switch sides. Now, Habibullah basically played his cards very well, because as long as there was no danger of British being completely routed and the Germans being able to send those sort of military forces to Afghanistan, Habibullah would basically have to do nothing. He would continue to be on the side of the British. So now the Germans eventually realized that their plans weren't going to work out, and they left Afghanistan. And their escape out of Afghanistan is actually quite a story by itself. On the western border with Afghanistan, as some of the Germans tried to escape, the person in charge of the cordon at that time was a certain guy named Colonel Reginald Dyer, for example. But the Germans largely succeeded in getting away. The Indian revolutionaries who were still there, Pratap and Barkatullah, actually formed a sort of provisional government of India, or self-styled provisional government of India, in December of that year. Pretty soon, Habibullah got tired of them also, and they also left. They left in 1917. They entered Russia at this time. Now, even a few months earlier, Russia would have been hostile. But at this time, Russia was in the throes of the Bolshevik Revolution, and suddenly these guys had found themselves on friendly soil. And so basically they were safe from the British. Now, what's interesting is that Mir Mast, who had been active throughout this time, he'd actually been a go-between between the German Hentig and Nasrallah, the conservative brother of the Afghan Emir. And he had not given up. And we do know that later in 1916, he went back to Tira along with, we are told, 2 Turk officers. And this comes from intelligence reports of the British. He tried to raise a sort of force of his own of anywhere between 200 to 400 men. They would hold a parade. The Turks would help train these people. And mind you, all this is happening when Mir Mast's brother, Mir Dast, has returned home and is basically seeing what his younger brother is doing and seems to be quite dismayed by it all. Eventually, as it turns out, even the Afridis are extremely divided at this time. A lot of the Afridi elders are very skeptical of these Turks. They believe these guys have obviously ulterior motives, and they fear British repression, British reprisals on them. So they basically go and warn the Turks to leave or come to harm. And the Turks eventually leave in about a day. Now, Mir Mast has actually taken a large loan on the understanding that Nasrallah would pay him back. And he's used this loan to basically raise this force of 200 to 400 men. And now Nasrallah is not going to pay him back because he's got his own troubles with his elder brother. So Mir Mast basically finds himself in debt. He's in trouble. He's unpopular within his own tribe. Eventually, in 1918, he dies in the influenza pandemic. And the British hear of this. And there's one bit of scribbling on a document in which a British bureaucrat writes, there's nothing to be regretted about it. So yeah, he died certainly unlamented by the British, perhaps unlamented by many of his own fellow Afridis.
What an absolutely mad lad. What a life the guy led, man. Coming from some little village to seeing the horrors of the First World War, to traveling across the world, meeting the Caliph, interacting with people from as far away as freaking Vancouver, attempting to raise up his own people and failing. You can't make this kind of stuff up. It's a truly amazing tale to hear.
Yeah, you'd say it's a stuff of films, but it's actually much better than anything in the movies.
Definitely better than any film that's recently been made about the British Raj that I can attest to. But tell us a little more about the context within which Mir Mast died, Aditya. You mentioned that he died in 1918, so a year after the Russian Revolution started, a year before the First World War officially ended. But what was happening in India at this time? Can you try and situate what this man did within the broader context of the Indian freedom struggle? Because clearly the impression that I've gotten from this is that Indians had already been trying quite vigorously to break free of the colonial rule. And keep in mind, this was in the early 1900s. So barely about 50 years since the British Crown really took over the rule of India. And you already see Indians trying to break away. And this is well before the period that Gandhi himself had risen to prominence, well before the time when the Indian National Congress basically started to present itself as the single standard bearer of Indian freedom. So what is happening? What is happening in the Raj?
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because even as this German, Turk, Indian expedition is in Afghanistan, there are other Ghadar plots going on, which the British are suppressing. There's a mutiny in Singapore in 1915. So the British actually get quite paranoid. And, when you combine this with the general convulsions that the First World War has caused, the rise of the independence movement, the British actually get quite paranoid. And in 1919, they passed the infamous Rowlatt Act, the so-called Black Act. And I would say that the revolutionary movements and the German expedition were definitely part of what catalyzed all these events, though this tends to be forgotten today. And immediately, of course, you have, in response to the Rowlatt Act, you have agitations all over India. And in April of that same year, you have the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar. And now what's happening at the same time is that there are convulsions in Afghanistan. In February of that same year, Habibullah has been assassinated mysteriously. And his younger brother Amanullah takes over, and he basically flings the conservative Nasrallah into prison, where, of course, this man mysteriously dies. Now, Amanullah has to consolidate his power. He has factions he needs to appease. And so he does proclaim a jihad. And what results is a series of skirmishes that we now call the Third Anglo-Afghan War. Now, Reginald Dyer, fresh from the massacre at Amritsar, is also involved in this conflict, where he actually acquits himself fairly well. And what happens as a result of this conflict, while the Afghans get a drubbing on the battlefield from the British and Indians, the truth is that British India is completely exhausted. Its soldiers are exhausted. It is fiscally exhausted. And it simply does not want to continue an unnecessary fight with the Afghans. Also, at this time, the Afghans have more negotiating leverage because they have Bolshevik Russia, which is looking to make its own inroads. So the Afghans and the British actually come to a treaty which gives Afghanistan much greater independence, allows it to open diplomatic channels with other countries and so on. This actually ends up being a move towards Afghan independence as well.
All right. Once again, wow. What an amazing life this chap led. And as we promised you at the beginning of this episode, here you have it. An ordinary life caught up in a truly extraordinary time, and in the truly extraordinary events that shaped this time. I hope that it's helped you understand the colonial period and the colonial Indian experience in a little more nuance than we have been presented to you in textbooks and terrible documentaries on the Discovery Channel. And on that note, thank you both Adityas for joining me, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. So it's been a really fun week on the network. Please do definitely check out all the regular shows that you do. But in addition, let me give you a few recommendations. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritasha and Ayushi talk siblings. Really fun episode. I think you'll enjoy that. Nishad Pai Vaidya is on Cyrus and they discuss cricket and a lot of different things around cricket. I think you'll enjoy that as well. Old friend Parmesh Shahani, he was on Absolutely Right. Definitely do check that out. Tamal Mills was on Edges and Sledges, another episode which I've heard really good things about. I haven't heard it yet. I need to listen to that soon. And guys, Uncle Please Sit, definitely listen to that. They've been killing it. This week they have Abby Phillips, he's a doctor talking about medical misinformation. Last week Paramita Vora was talking about sex education and who needs it. They've been really killing it. Definitely do check that out. And with that, hope to see you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.